Thanks, Liz. Okay, good evening, everyone, and nice to meet you all. And I suppose Happy New Year to you, and hope you had a good Christmas and some time off and to relax and recharge the batteries ahead of this year. I'm going to give a quick introduction to who I am in a few minutes, but maybe if I ask you all just to briefly say who you are and what organisation you're with, so I can know who I'm talking to, if that'd be okay. So, Micheál, you're next to me on screen, so if I can ask you to start off.
I work with a group called Cara Bio, based in Galway, Tom.
Very good.
Mostly we've been looking at Irish funding from Leader, Law Pro, local authorities. We had a couple of nibbles at Life, but didn't get past the first concept note stage, but we might have another go at it sometime.
Okay, very good. Okay, and Constance?
Oh, sorry, hi. I'm the Island Development Manager at the Rivers Trust, so I'm helping the trust hopefully to find funding.
Okay, very good.
And giving them leads. So
okay, that's good, thank you. And Elena?
Sorry, I'm a bit slow here. Yeah, I'm Elena. I'm a volunteer with the Inkind Rivers Trust, so I'm the supporting act here. Just eager to learn everything about funding applications.
That's great. Thanks, Elena. And Linda?
Yeah, Linda and Chris Huxley were with the Loch Cara Catchment Association. We've just been successful with the Life projects, which is due to start any moment now.
Very good. Excellent. Yeah. Well done. Okay, and Jennifer?
Hi, I am volunteer with the River Moy Trust based in Foxford, and just here to learn, I suppose, tips and tricks when it comes to funding applications.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. And Kevin?
I am Kevin. I'm involved with Daughter Action in Dublin, and as well as I'm involved with the team is setting up the new Liffey Rivers Trust.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Kevin. And Trish?
Hi, I'm Trish Murphy. I'm a project officer with the Inkind Rivers Trust. Lots of funding applications out there and just reviewing them yesterday. So just would really like to help, make decisions about what you should just let go and what you should go for.
Okay, very good. And Sally? Sorry, Sally, you're on mute there.
Can you hear me there now?
You can, yeah.
Okay. I'm Sally. I'm from the Mill River Conservation Group. I'm secretary with them, and I'm also a volunteer with Inkind Rivers Trust. And with the Mill Group, we had our first Law Pro grant to have a feasibility study done in 2021 for a new group. So that's
very good. Okay.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Thanks, Sally. And Muireann?
Hi, everyone. My name is Muireann. I'm with the Boyne Valley. It's not called the Boyne Valley, the Boyne Rivers Trust. So we're literally just starting at the very embryonic stage of getting registered. We haven't applied for any funding yet. I know Constanze there we've been in touch, but nice to see all the other faces. Yeah, we're hoping to start applying for grants this year.
Very good. Thanks, Muireann. And Gerard?
Yeah, I'm with the Loch Cara Catchment Association as well, so I just said I'd come along and see what's going on this evening, along with Linda and Chris Huxley.
Very good, thanks, Gerard. And finally, Alan?
I'm with the River Blackwater Catchment Trust. That's the Ulster Blackwater. So we're chasing funding north and south. We're a cross-border organisation.
Very good. Okay, excellent. Thanks, Alan. Okay, thank you. So we're just going to share the screen with you here and just bring up tonight's presentation. 2 seconds here. Can you all see that?
It's just appearing. Yeah.
Okay, so just give you a small bit of background to who I am and what I do. So my name is Tom O'Leary from O'Leary and Associates Training and Consultancy, based here in Kerry. So we've offices in Tralee and Listowel, and currently working from home in North Kerry as well. So I've over 20 years experience of working, I suppose primarily started off work as a development officer with a local development company in Dublin, Northside Partnership, and then worked with a partnership Tralee, which are now part of NEWKD. in Tralee and County Kerry, working with communities as a social enterprise officer. So my role was to get social enterprises and community and voluntary organisations and projects off the ground, very much from a pre-planning phase to through planning phase, and then through funding phases, and then through supporting them with kind of sustainability and viability as they develop their enterprises. In 2002, I went part-time self-employed. In 2005, I set up my own consultancy, doing pretty much what I've been doing with as an employee with local development sectors. So I primarily focus on feasibility studies for not-for-profit organisations on project development, capital projects, large-scale projects prior to them going for funding. So normally, if a group are going for a large capital grant, for example, they'll do an initial feasibility study on maybe a building assessment, kind of business modelling, financial analysis, impact analysis. So I work with a kind of a team of architects, engineers, economists, accountants, and we then would do kind of full feasibility on those projects. My role in that would be very much focused on the business models element of it and the financial element in terms of where they could source the funding from and putting the best case forward when they're applying for those grants. We do a lot of work around community planning and project planning with community and voluntary organisations and with communities and parishes and towns and villages. Again, looking at what's needed within their community, doing needs analysis, and then based on that, applying for funds with them in relation to what they've identified as projects within their community. We also then do strategic and business planning to support capital or support grant applications. So again, if the groups we work with are looking for, say, commercial loans or social finance loans, we work with them in developing business plans to support those applications. And then we work with groups around developing 3 or 5 year strategic plans as well. We do mentoring and training. So we do a lot of training like this with groups through local development companies, local authorities, PPNs, basically kind of, I suppose, showing groups like yourselves what's involved in planning, funding, grant applications, governance, a whole range of different type of training programs. And then I suppose the key thing we do, and I do and have been doing for the last 20 odd years, is trying to help groups get funds, whether that's through grant support or advising them on what sort of debt finance they can get, or also advising on things like sponsorship, corporate partnerships, fundraising models, things like that. So all the groups I work with, I don't work with private sector. I work primarily with the not-for-profit sector. So all the groups I work with are reliant on, well, some have income streams, but majority are reliant on, 80% of their income is coming from either grants or from fundraising or from sponsorship or things like that. So we do a lot of work around, we're working with groups in terms of giving them the skills so they don't have to go and pay for consultants to do applications for them or do work for them. We show them what's involved in getting these funds and allowing them to be more sustainable year in, year out. So that's basically what I do. I kind of take a very, very practical approach to both the consultancy work and the training. So I don't kind of lecture to people in terms of what they should be doing. It's more on my experience of working with groups and what the kind of the pitfalls are out there in terms of funds and funding and what to avoid and what you should be doing and not be doing. So it's more all coming from my own experience and experience working with groups rather than any kind of academic or kind of theoretical opinion on it. So the program itself, for yourselves over the next 3, so it's 3 workshops, as you're aware. So it's nice, next Wednesday and the following Wednesday. And I've taken what we have as a larger program on how to get funding and how to apply for funds and write grant applications. I've kind of taken that down and I've kind of broken down to 3 sections for this purpose. Tonight's session really is looking at kind of an overview and also looking at kind of the planning that's involved before you actually look for grants, because a lot of groups kind of go straight into looking for funding and start chasing grants and are successful in getting grants in a lot of cases. But in our experience, a lot of groups that get a lot of grants kind of regret that they've actually applied for them because it just brings on more additional work, more additional administration. It actually adds to the bottom line rather than taking from it. So again, it's very important to kind of be careful in terms of and strategic in terms of what you're applying for, why you're applying for it, is there a need for it, and can you sustain it? And is it a viable option for you, or is it worth just basically ignoring and kind of walking away from? No, it's very hard to walk away from free money, and that's what grants are. It's basically money that's given to you that doesn't have to be repaid. Well, in a lot of cases, doesn't have to be repaid. And that's very, very difficult, and it's very attractive to kind of say, well, why are we not going for this? And sometimes if you're dealing with boards or committees, they might be insisting that, look, we should go for this money, let's go after it. But in a lot of cases, we would say to a lot of our organizations we work with, no, we don't think you should apply for that grant or that funds, because it's not meeting your overall strategic needs. It's going to add a layer of bureaucracy onto what's already a fairly bureaucratic, structure, or it just might be worth applying for, because the monies involved are just so tiny that they won't even make a dent on what you actually need. So it really depends on what you're applying for and what you're looking at. So as I said, it's going to be broken onto 3 sessions. I'll take your lead after this evening in terms of what grants you want to specifically focus on, because I want to make sure this is relevant to you. So if you're applying for specific grants over the next number of months, or there's some grants that come up pretty much in the next month or in this month, if you want to focus more on that, then we can do that. So I'll make it as practical as possible. So rather than just kind of covering generic grant supports that are out there, it might make more sense for me to maybe pick a number of grants that you're looking at, and to maybe advise you over the next couple of weeks as to what you should be doing to give yourself the best possible chance of getting those grants. So I can take your lead on that. At the end of the session tonight, we might have a quick discussion on that to see what you require. As I was saying to Liz earlier before Christmas, when we tender for this piece of work, I also provide email support between the workshops as well, because it's very difficult to get an awful lot of things across to a group of people in 1.5 hour sessions. So you might have questions for me after this evening that you might think of tonight, or you might think of tomorrow morning, or whatever. Just feel free to email me, and I'll see if I can advise you as best I possibly can. So I want to make sure at the end of the 3 weeks that you're tooled up to have the best possible options going forward with your grant applications. If there's specific things you want me to look at in relation to grants that are coming up that you're looking at, again, feel free to email me any questions you might have, or if you want just my opinion on something, that's fair enough as well. I won't write grant applications for you, just to put that out there now. I'll give you some steer, but I won't drive the car. So yeah, but again, just feel free to bounce ideas off me over the next number of weeks, and I'll get back to you. Not maybe straight away, but certainly within a day or two, and I'll come back to you on that. So okay, that's basically me, and that's kind of an overview of the program itself. So what I spend a lot of time working with groups on is when I'm asked to do a session like this on grants and how to apply for grants, and what's the process of how do I find where grants are, and how do I apply for them, and what should I put into the application form, and how should I word the application form. I take people way before that process, and we look at the whole area of financial planning. And it's an area that a lot of organizations are very good at, and it's an area a lot of organizations are very, very poor at. And what I find a lot in my experience for the last 20 odd years is that a lot of groups that are going after grants are kind of panicking. They're looking for funds from any possible source that they can find, because they're struggling to meet their budgets each year. They're struggling to keep afloat. There's a lot more money going out than coming in. And a lot of organizations like local community volunteer organizations, they do what we call kind of panic fundraising, just to bring in money to cover outgoings, because they haven't really looked at what their requirements are over 12 months or even beyond 12 months in terms of what their financial commitments are and their future financial requirements are. And what we spend a lot of time doing is working out in terms of, okay, well, where's your main source of income coming from at the moment? What's your main source of funding? What are your current overheads each year? What are your future project development costs going to be? What projects do you want to develop over the next 12 months? And have you put a cost or even a kind of a rough estimate of what those costs are? And that's really important, because that will determine, one, how much money you need, and two, where you can actually maybe look at how you can split your projects and your organization into different kind of funding brackets as such, so you can then identify maybe potential funds that can actually go towards that. So we do a lot of work with groups around, let's say they'll fundraise to cover some of their costs each year. They look for core grant data to cover maybe some of their operational costs, like staffing costs each year. if they're looking at, say, project development, they'll identify projects that they want to develop, and then they'll identify funds for those specific projects. But then they'll look beyond those projects after they're funded, and they say, okay, if we develop this fund or this project with this specific grant, how can we fund this project long-term when that grant is gone? So the example I always use is of a group, let's say, for example, getting a grant to buy a bus, like a youth group, for example, getting a grant to buy a bus, so they can bring the kids and their participants from and to different whatever. And they get a grant to buy a bus, everyone's delighted about that, but they don't get a grant to buy the diesel, they don't get a grant to buy the insurance, they don't get a grant to get a driver. So they've got this really nice bus, but they can't actually use it because they've known to drive it, and they can't afford to put diesel in the tank. So what we do is, before they apply for the grant, for the bus, we say, okay, if you get the bus, how do you fund this thing long term? And that's the key. So how do you plan for this, 2, 3 years, 4 years down the line? How do you get a replacement bus in 4 years' time? So it's all about long-term planning. Okay, so there's a lot of kind of rush to, let's apply for a grant, let's get the money in. Everyone's delighted with that. And it does bring in a new project, or does bring in another element, or adds to what you're currently doing. But you have to ask the question, after that grant is gone and the money is spent, we've done what we said we'll do, we not only keep that project going, and this is a one-off project, which is very, a very specific project with a very specific time frame. How do we keep this thing going long term? So we're doing work with, say, groups, and we're doing 4 of them at the moment, 4 feasibility studies on large scale capital projects, building projects. We've asked them all, once you get the grants to build and extend and renovate, how do you keep this pace going in 12 months' time? How do you pay for insurance? How do you pay for lights and heat? How do you pay for all the costs of running this thing? And that's really where the focus is on. So we look at the plan that needs to be put in place to do that. So the key thing really is that, I suppose, you're all running not-for-profit organizations, so you're not focused on profit, because you're not commercial organizations where you have to make money to survive. But you have to start thinking like a normal for-profit organization, because you need to make sure there's enough money coming in to cover the money going out. Okay, and that's why cash flow is really key consideration for any organization. So when you're looking at your projects, you're applying for grants, you'd have to submit some sort of annual reports or annual set of accounts. The organizations that are assessing these applications will look at how you're currently doing financially. So if you're struggling financially, and you're loss-making situation each year, and you don't have a very good track record in fundraising, the chance of getting support from them in terms of grant support will be limited, because they don't want to give an organization a grant, additional funding that's just maybe going to go into a black hole of debt, or you don't have the capacity, or you don't show the capacity to be able to manage that funds longer term. So they'll pick a winner, and they'll go after an organization that's very well structured, very well financed, and it is looking fairly comfortable financially. So the key thing is, there has to be more money coming in than going out. And that's where the planning comes into it. So the key thing I always say to my organizations I work with, and I've had arguments with funders in the past where they said, some organizations are making too much money and they got too much reserves and they're actually showing a profit at the end of the year. Just because you're not a for-profit organization doesn't mean you're a far loss organization. Okay, so your job in any organization, if you're in charge of the administration or if you're in charge of the funding, you've got to make sure that you're at least break even. But you have to make sure there's more money than just that coming in, that you have a reserve every year. Because if you don't have a reserve every year, you're not going to be able to progress projects. And that goes back to what we're talking about planning. So a lot of groups, for example, they have nothing left in the account at the end of any year, and there's no reserves. If you're applying for a grant date, very rarely we get 100% funding in terms of grants. You have to show matching funds. So they have no matching funds because there's no reserves. So then they're saying, okay, we need to fundraise to find these matching funds, which might have only a 6-week window to apply for the grant. You're not going to fundraise the matching funds in 6 weeks. So you're now stuck with a situation you can't apply for a grant because you're not meeting the matching funding criteria. Then you decide to borrow it. But because you know track record in fundraising, you're not going to borrow the money because you've got no repayment capacity proven to the bank that you're borrowing from. So it's really important when you're looking at planning that you're looking at long-term, how much money you need to bring into the organization each year, how much you need to have in reserve each year, because it's the reserve money that allows you to benefit from the grant aid going forward. Some grants, 100% grant aided, no problem, but majority you're going to look for matching funds. And that's where a lot of groups get caught out, is they don't have the longer term plan in place to create those reserves and to create that matching funds. So what is funding needed for? Operational costs, your ongoing funding requirements. And the issue with grants, in most cases, is that grants don't cover operational costs. They won't cover ongoing costs. They won't cover things like rent, rates, light, heat, staffing requirements. Some grants will, if they're core funding grants, we call them, but like your most grants that are coming up time and time again each year for one-off projects or for specific pieces of work, not to cover kind of ongoing running costs, or for new projects. Your funding is required to have a reserve policy, which is just mentioned there, to have money in reserve to allow you to develop projects, to reinvest back into the organization, to reinvest back into projects, and to have that matching funding requirements there when you need it. It might be specific funding for project analysis. So I think maybe Sally mentioned there about getting a feasibility study grant under LawPro. Again, that would be a feasibility study to do a specific piece of work, a specific study on or analysis on a specific project you're trying to develop. We just completed one there for a group in our area under LawPro just before Christmas on a river walk and recreational park. And the outcome of that study, showed that it was a viable project to deliver and develop, and now they're going to use that study to apply for funding this year for capital funding. So they've proven the need for it, they've shown it can be done, and now they're going to go for capital funding based on that feasibility. Feasibility study funding is a lot easier to get than capital funding, because again, there's no long-term commitment required or long-term requirement there. So with capital grant, I'll say, like a large-scale capital grant, you got to show that you can sustain this project that's been funded long term, whereas a feasibility study is very much kind of the start finish date. The study could say, look, we're not recommending to go forward, or we're recommending to go forward. So it's easier normally to get feasibility grant or development analysis grant aid than capital grant. Then you might look at into develop projects. You might be looking at capital funding and capital grants. So that could be for to develop new projects, or it could be to enhance existing projects or upgrade existing projects, and that really is where most of the funding is available towards. And there's lots and lots of grant streams available for capital funding, all ranging from a couple hundred euros up to thousands of euros, or hundreds of thousands of euros, or millions of euros in some cases. I think it's probably these last two is where you're probably going to be focusing most of your attention on in relation to this program, or these training courses. But I think you need to be making sure that you're not losing track of these as well. A lot of groups you work with are kind of I suppose the whole kind of project development kind of dominates their thinking and their strategy and their work they do. And they kind of tend to forget about, well, we need to keep the show on the road as well while we're doing all this work. So they tend to kind of forget about, doing the day-to-day stuff and looking at the larger projects. And sometimes the larger projects then can actually impact on their current projects, because sometimes because they haven't planned them through, the larger projects they're taking on board are being subsidized by their existing projects. So it starts eating into their income. Liz, you have a hand up there?
Yeah, it's actually operational costs is probably one of our biggest concerns. Yep. Not so much capital, maybe as the Rivers Trust develop, but covering operational costs, accountancy, insurance, I would say is the one thing that is the hardest thing to meet for what funders allow for it.
Yeah, it is, and it's the same. It's the same with every, I suppose, across the sector. As I said, go back to the kind of the bus analogy again. It's very easy to get the funding to buy the bus, but there's very little funding out there for the actual running of the bus, and that's causing a lot of problems. A lot of groups is that they need staff to run their organizations, and there's not very many grants out there to cover staffing costs. I know of 3 groups in one we're doing some work with who have no problem getting they've no problem getting capital grants to do renovations to their buildings at the moment, but they've got a loan of about, I think it's about 200,000 euros left on to pay off their loan, and they're struggling to meet their loan repayments every month. So they're like, why are we getting grants to actually add more to our existing building when we can barely afford to pay off the loan on what we already have? But it's just, you're not going to get grants for things like that. So yeah, we can look at what kind of core funding is out there as well as part of this, and see what might be available for yourselves in the organizations you're with. And a lot of times, if there is funding available for operation costs, it's very much for a specific period of time, and you have to be able to show how we're going to, after this grant is gone, how we're going to keep this thing going and how we're going to sustain it. And it's a big issue within the sector, across all elements of the not-for-profit sector. It doesn't matter what area, whether it be environment, tourism, community services, rural transport, childcare. Sustainability is the biggest issue. After initial projects are gone off the ground, how do we sustain them long term? And that is something that every group has to look at. So we look at cost analysis. So again, in terms of before you even start looking at grants, you need to be very clear in terms of what are your costs, and review those costs regularly and see, is there any way we can reduce those costs down, or is there ways we can look at bringing in additional revenue to cover some of those costs, or can we kind of compartmentalize those costs so we can actually look at maybe specific funds to cover them. So again, I know a lot of groups that will use sponsorship, for example, and sponsors cover part of their costs, like maybe their broadband is sponsored by a telecommunications company, transport costs might be covered by a car dealership. There's different ways. We've got groups that have got, say, maybe commercial kitchens, we're doing Meals on Wheels, and part of their overheads are covered by food companies or by local retailers or by kitchen suppliers or whatever it might be. The questions I would have asked, if we're looking at grant support for groups, normally we would ask a number of questions before we get involved. And the one thing these are kind of the three kind of key things I would question. If it doesn't add revenue to the project, I question why you're doing it. In other words, and revenue, I don't mean like you're going charging for the service you're providing, but is this project going to bring in additional support? If we get funding to set up a new project, to develop a new project, will it bring in additional support for us? So will it open up avenues for more money to come in? In some cases, that might be fees that you're bringing in for certain services, or it might just open up more avenues for grant support. But if it's adding to your overall cost base, but not bringing in anything else on the other side, then you'd question why you're doing it, because it's going to add more cost to your already kind of maybe struggling organization. If it doesn't benefit the strategic direction of the organization or project, again, I'd question it. This is a big thing. A lot of groups, as I said at the beginning, chase grants, and you're kind of wondering, why are they going after this grant? It's got nothing to do with what they're actually about. It doesn't tie into their overall strategy. It doesn't tie into their aims, doesn't tie into their objectives. They're literally chasing this grant because it's free money. Okay, I'm not saying that necessarily is a wrong thing to do or a bad thing to do, but in my experience, what happens is it takes people away from their core work they do, and it's bringing another layer on, another layer of bureaucracy, administration, another cost that's just, there's people within the office thinking, why did they apply for this? Why did they go after this grant? It's not doing anything for us, but only causing us problems. I'm not saying that not to do it, because sometimes it does allow you to diversify into another area and to bring in on another layer, and that layer could actually bring in other additional supports. So I know, for example, with some groups that we work with, they especially environmental groups like yourselves, we'll look at heritage as being another area they could start focusing on, because they can tap into more grants through that. I know of other groups, again, they would look at the whole tourism element of it. So they're looking at what potential grants are out there from a tourism perspective that we can tap into now. So the project is very much focused on maybe the environmental element of the project. But now, because they're providing, or they're, say, managing a water, wherever it might be, they're looking at, okay, we can now start maybe looking at tourism options, or looking at how we can attract visitors to the area, because we have activities we can run on the water, or blue waste, for example, is an example of that, or whatever. So we're working with a lot of groups in coastal villages over the years and coastal towns that have applied for flag funding, because there was funding available for marine-based projects, and their main focus wasn't on that, but because there was funds available, they thought, okay, we can now tap into this sector, because we can bring in funding, additional funding we weren't getting before. So they're not doing something completely different. They're just basically looking at other things they can do within the projects they have, and thinking kind of outside the box. But just be very careful that you're not just going after funds for the sake of it, because that normally ends up with more work without any great return. So if it's not really needed, and this is a huge one, because this is what the funders will look for. If you can't prove there's a need for what you're applying for, you're not going to get money for it. So, it's getting before, like, you always have to have some sort of needs analysis done, or some sort of a project proposal, or a business plan or a feasibility study or something done to show why you're applying for this grant, and why you need it, and what you're going to do with it. That was always the case, but because the whole grant sector and grant space is so competitive now, you really need to put your best case forward in terms of why we need this money, what we're going to do with it, and what difference it's going to make within our communities. And that's really important. You have to be able to document that and evidence it. So some, like a committee sitting on a table thinking this would be a really good idea, let's apply for this grant, that doesn't really work anymore. You've got to show, we've done the consultation, we've done the needs analysis, we've done the stakeholder analysis, we've looked at what we need, we've identified as a need for this project, we've looked at the project, we've looked at what the impact would be at local level, we've actually measured that impact, potential impact if we develop the project or if we don't develop the project. And that's really important to document that. Okay, so, and that doesn't mean you have to submit like, an 80-page study. That's literally just, bullet pointing or even referencing work you've already done or studies you've already done. So again, if you have got, say, funding for a feasibility study from LawPro, for example, in the past, when you apply now for a grant on the strength of that, that's going to be a benefit because they've already funded you to do the work. You've done the work, they've done the analysis, and you've shown that this is actually something we can develop and deliver. But it really is important that you not only from the point of view of grant and ticking a box and getting the work, getting the analysis done, so you can say you've done it. But it's also important to actually make sure there's a need for it. Because there's a lot of projects all over the country that have been funded for many, many years and granted, and you're thinking, why did they ever get granted? There's never need for it in the community. And most of those that got those grants, where there was very rarely a need identified, or they presumed there was, but there wasn't really a need, they're all struggling now because they're not being supported. They're not open because no one really wants to use the facilities, or there's no need for the services or they're providing, or they're just struggling to get support to the local community. And they're all now struggling to keep afloat. And if you ask them all, they'll say, well, if we look back, 20 years ago, we probably never done this now because, it was never probably needed in the first place, but we got a grant for it, so we said we do it. And that to me is very, very bad value for money, very bad value for taxpayers' money. And, I think it's wrong because you're then stopping some other group who does need the money from getting it. So that's really important for me. And I don't really get involved in projects where I can't see there's a need for it, or they haven't proven to me there's a need for it. Not because I don't want to, because they won't get granted. Again, as I said, if it's additional one-off funding, which most of them are, if it leads to additional administration costs or adds to overall operational costs post-funding, then question it. You have to look at the grant that you're applying for. What happens after the grant is gone? How much is this going to cost us to run each year? Is going to cost us more money every year to run this project because we've now added it on to what we're doing. And that's really important. And if you can see a way of sustaining the project after the initial grant date, then I really would question why you would do it. Because a lot of people think that, well, look, sure, we'll get the grant, we'll do what we need to do, we have the funding for 2 or 3 years, and then at the end of year 3, we'll worry about how we keep it going after that. That's not really best practice. That's kind of getting in a car, driving from Kerry to Dublin with half a tank of diesel, hoping that halfway along the road you'll find the petrol station is open to fill the rest of the tank. It's kind of risky. A lot of groups do it. Some groups do get around it and they get lucky. A lot of other groups don't. And what happens then is they've created an expectation at a local level. They're doing some really good work, and then all of a sudden the money's gone and they can't sustain it any longer and they stop it. So just be careful what it costs after the grant is brought in. This happens a lot with, say, maybe pilot projects, where you might get one-off projects to bring in maybe, like, say, a coordinator to run a project for a year or 2 years. Who's going to pay for that coordinator after year 2? How is it sustained after that? So we would normally, if we're looking at projects that are involving, kind of like a pilot project where you've got a coordinator for maybe 2 or 3 years being funded, part of the job role that we would put on a job description would be that their job is to secure funding to keep themselves in a job after year 2. That's part of their job, is to look at other source of funding for the 2 years to allow it to keep going. Looking for a solution to the problem at the end of the program or the end of the project, that rarely works. You might get extensions, but that's only, again, just kind of delaying the inevitable. And then as well, look at costs that can be covered through in-kind support or voluntary support. It's not always about getting money in. A lot of the costs that you would incur can be covered through in-kind support. And what I mean by that is where a local company will provide services for free. The examples I normally would use or would see would be, like, say, web design. Companies, say, doing a website for an organization for nothing, or offering to manage their website for nothing for maybe a year. Maybe someone doing social media for an organization for free. Accountancy supports is another one. HR supports, legal supports. Where you're paying for professional fees. Those professional fees in some cases can be covered, where an organization locally or company locally is providing those supports to you for free. Always value those contributions as well, because you can put a value on it. So if you're getting a website for free that will cost you €4,000, that's €4,000 that as a cost that you've now secured through in-kind support. Voluntary labour as well, which is probably what we all rely on within the sector. And without it, it wouldn't exist. And volunteers, there wouldn't be a sector without volunteers. In a lot of cases, with the grant support you're applying for, you can put in voluntary labour as contribution cost. There's usually fairly strict conditions around that. It's not overly strict. It's just you've got to be careful in terms of how you account for it and how you do the administration on it. But if it's done right and planned properly, it can save you an awful lot of money, especially with a lot of capital projects where you're bringing in, say, volunteer labour as contribution towards the overall costs. The other thing is in the case of some capital grants, you can put in, if you've got a premises or land or a site, you can put in the cost, or sorry, the value of that asset, or whether it be the building or the site, as contribution towards the overall matching contribution as well. So always look at non-financial, either supports towards your cost base or supports towards your new projects in terms of keeping your overall costs down. We're currently doing a project here in our local village with a local committee who bought a building 2 years ago for €80,000. It's a 5,000 square foot old dance hall. It's going to cost them, if they do it through the proper channels in terms of tendering for it, it's going to cost them 1.2 million to renovate, which they can't afford and they can't get. And they're now looking at bringing in a project manager to do it all through kind of direct labour. But there's a lot of local builders that have said to give their time to the works, as well. So again, it's a way of keeping the costs down. So we've gone from 1.2 million to down to about €600,000, which now is manageable. So rather than saying no to the project, just looked at other ways of doing it. And there's always other ways as well. We're doing work, as I said, with another group in North Kerry here who are developing River Walk. There's a local guy who's got a plant hire company. He's going to do he's going to grade some of the site for them. They got volunteers already lined up that's going to do some work in terms of the labouring on the project. They have a local graphic designer who's going to design all the signage for them for free. They've got a number of companies going to sponsor equipment, things as well like that. So they've cut their project cost down by about 40% just by looking at bringing in voluntary in-kind support. So it can be done. I suppose the budget is something that you all seen and you all have. What we tend to do with this is that we look at the overall budget for the year in terms of your operational costs, and we look at when are these costs coming out? Is there any specific times of the year where there's more costs coming out than normal? So let's say your insurance repayments are up, or your insurance is due a specific time of the year, whatever it might be. What we try and do with a lot of our groups is that we get them to kind of manage their outgoings over the course of 12 months. So rather than having their insurance goes out once a year, they spread it out over 12 months. Again, things like, say, they, instead of looking at, professional fees, paying them once a year to your accountant, again, put them over 12 months. But where you might have, let's say, in some groups where they will have, certain times of the year where there's higher costs because they might have seasonal elements to their project. That's really where it's important, where you need to look at, well, when do we need to bring this money in? When do we need to fundraise? When do we need to have, the reserve in the account? Because again, as I said, you can't go out there and sell more. You're not commercial organizations who can just basically try to sell more products or up your prices or whatever to bring in additional income in. You got to look at bringing it in through grants or sponsors or fundraising, and that takes time. So you need to look at the kind of longer term planning for that. So what we normally do is look at the overheads down here at the bottom, and then look at in top in terms of, can we charge for fees? Can we bring in money through some sort of fee structure? That could be, training, it could be rental, it could be, service you're providing, it could be venues you're providing, it could be educational course that you're delivering, it could be membership fees, it could be a range of different things you want to develop. Some organizations we work with have a trading arm, so they have charity shops, things like that they run to bring in money to subsidize their service they're providing. Fundraising, again, have you got a strategy around that for the year? Sponsors, have you got sponsors? Have you got partners? Have you got a strategy around it? And this is probably something that, alongside the grants, will be probably one of the more important ones for yourselves to look in terms of bringing in corporate sponsors on board on some of the projects you're developing and delivering. And again, some tapped area in Ireland, I'm not very good at it, but there's a lot of companies out there making lots of money who want to get involved in local projects. they might have an angle they want to go on. They've part of their corporate social responsibility might be looking at their environmental responsibilities. The way around that is by supporting yourselves. And then obviously grants. So with the grants, it's a bit of, keeping an eye on what's out there, when are they coming up, and marking in on a diary what the deadlines are, and then working backwards from that in terms of what planning is involved to get those grants in on time. There's a good bit of work involved in that element of it, because as I think it was Jenny said there, Jennifer at the very beginning said there's a lot of grants coming up at the moment, or maybe it might be Trish, sorry, said it. A lot of grants out there at the moment, a lot of more grants coming up over the next number of months. And it's kind of this barrage of grant applications that are opening up the whole time. And unless you're really keeping an eye on them and keeping on top of those, you're going to start missing deadlines, or you're not going to you might even be aware of them. So that's something that we'll be concentrating on over the next number of nights in terms of how you keep an eye on those. One thing we would do in working with our groups is that they would all have a very simple spreadsheet like this, and they would have marked in, and normally they're live spreadsheets as well, so they update them regularly, and then mark in on their spreadsheets, on Excel or whatever they're using, the deadlines, and they start working back from that. So they're really keeping on tracking their grant application process, and it just means they're way more efficient to getting things done, and having all the relevant information in place when the grants are coming up, so that they're not just kind of panic mode for the last week, and trying to gather all the necessary documentation. Everything's pretty much in place, and there's no real skill involved in that. It's just down to your organization and administration skills, really. It's been organized, really, is the key thing. We try to recommend that there's at least one person that's responsible for it, and then working with maybe a team of people to support that person when it comes to actually doing the grants application. But one person's responsible. Whereas delegated out to a number of people, you want to start missing deadlines. It's just, having a team of people working on grants doesn't, in my experience, work. You need the one person that's responsible for it, and that's all they do is look at the grant side of things. Now, that could be paid member staff, or it could be volunteer or committee member. There is a lot of work involved in it at the outset. Once you get a good system in place, though, it becomes a bit of kind of like rinse and repeat type of thing, because most grants are pretty much the same. They're looking for the same information. So once you've done one or two or a couple of them, you start getting better and better at it, and you start just basically turning them over very, very quickly. You also start getting better at the application itself as well, so you start getting better results as well in terms of getting the grants. Okay, so that's a simple Excel spreadsheet, budget sheet that you've all seen in the past. It is something that is really important from a planning point of view, because it will determine, this is all about going for money, so it's all determined in terms of, okay, all of this, outgoings down here, what could be covered by a grant? What can we assign a specific grant to, if we can assign a grant to it? If we can't, if there's no grant date to cover the operational costs, then how do we bring in the fees? How do we bring in fundraising and sponsors to cover some of these costs here? Okay, and that's how you start looking at a breakdown of how you fund specific elements of your project. This is your kind of ongoing operational budget. We would then have specific budgets then for projects. So, for example, if you're developing a new project where there's capital works involved, we would have a capital budget or capital project budget where we manage that. So money that's specifically relating to the project, how is that being managed in terms of expenditure, in terms of costs and cash flow? So, for example, if you're applying for a grant, you won't get the grant up front. You've got to spend the money first and then draw down the grant. Okay, so let's say this is a project that's costing 100,000 euros, and there's 4 phases involved in the development of it. You got to look at the cash flow management then to make sure that you're drawing down a grant in time to allow the next phase to develop. And that can be tricky in terms of, depending on who you're dealing with, because sometimes, the grant process is slow in the drawdown, and you might run into problems in terms of cash flow problems where the money's not drawn down quick enough to cover the next phase, and now you're into an overdraft situation in the bank. So it's really important that you have a budget specifically for one-off projects, no matter how small they are, because if they go out of control, you're going to start running into problems financially. Okay, and now they'll start coming into your ongoing costs, because now you're paying off a loan longer term to cover to subsidize the actual spend in the one-off project. So it's really important. Now, it's not so much in smaller scale projects, usually not an issue, but where you're into larger scale capital projects, it can be an issue. A lot of groups get into serious problems where it comes to drawing down grants, they just don't, they're not drawing down on time because their paperwork's not in order, just slow in getting the work back into the departments, or the departments are slow in getting the money back out again. And that can cause serious problems with a lot of projects, especially for very, very big capital projects where there's construction involved. And you got engineers and architects and quantity surveyors and builders involved. A lot of people getting a lot of itchy fees around, not being paid on time and not getting the money back in time. They can cause major problems. So it's really important that they're planned out with a very detailed project budget plan when you're doing that from the outset, and that's separate from your ongoing operational budget, which is in front of us here. And so capital projects, again with capital projects, no, I'm just picking construction as one here. Again, a lot of people think, oh, we need to just get tenders and quotations for the costs of building, the building works, construction, but they forget about all the other fees that are associated with it. So things like your professional fees, like construction drawings, construction costings, planning fees, and then all the other surveys that need to be required from a planning point of view. So we're working with a group there last year who were looking at a large scale project, and the case said to me, Tom, we need, I think it was like 600,000 euros what they were looking for. And they came back to me with all the quotations they got, or sorry, the bill of quantities got from their quantity surveyor. And they hadn't factored in things like contingencies, they hadn't factored in things like insurance costs, preliminary costs, or professional fees. And when we went back and we looked at all those costs, their costs of their overall project were going up by 20%. Okay. In the last 6 months, because of building costs, those costs have gone up by another 20%. So where they came to me, say maybe 12 months ago, they're now looking at 40% more they require to get the project off the ground. So a lot of times people forget about the other costs that are associated with something. And there's always other costs there you got to look at. So we always ask the questions, have you factored in every single element of this project in terms of the cost? And very, very, very often not, they don't factor in the professional fees, the planning fees, things like that. And they can be very expensive. The golden kind of rule at the moment is that it's 10% of the overall cost for professional fees, which is a lot. So you've got a €1 million project, it's 100,000 euros will go towards professional fees. Then they forget to factor in VAT on top of that. So a lot of quotations together are excluding that, and that they might be 13.5% or 23% onto it. So where they've gone for X amount of money, they've underestimated by 13.5% or 23%. You can't claim the VAT back, you're not VAT registered, so therefore that causes problems as well. So it's all about looking at the plan and planning and seeing, okay, what is the overall cost here? What do we really need in terms of a fund? Because you can't go back a second time and say, look, we underestimated what it's going to cost to this project. We're looking for more money. It doesn't really work that way. That frightens the life out of the departments, because now they're thinking this group will not be able to start the project or won't be able to complete the project, and we'll be looking to reclaim the money back off them. And the departments do not want to do that. Last thing the department wants to do is take money back off you, because they got to explain it to their bosses and their ministers in terms of why this money's come back into the pot again. So they will look for, and that's why currently, and in the past, but definitely now in the moment, they're looking for all these kind of guarantees from you that this project can start in time. They're all using this word shovel-ready projects. Is the project shovel-ready? Is there any kind of hidden problem here that will stop this project from starting or from being completed? If there is, they won't touch it. And if there is, you shouldn't be touching it either. So a lot of groups, they underestimate what's involved, they underestimate the time involved, the money involved, the issues that might be involved, and they kind of jump in head first and then realize they can't really swim, and that's a problem. So it's not just a problem for you, it's a massive problem for the departments. If you can show that you've got everything in place, you're shovel ready, the project's ready to go, all the issues have been identified, all the surveys have been done, all planning's in place, funds are in place, everything's good to go, you will have a huge advantage over the other organizations, because a lot of organizations won't be at that level. They'll be going in maybe 90% ready, but they won't be 100% ready. If you can show you're 100% ready to develop this project or to get this off the ground, you would have a huge chance. And that can only happen if you're organized and you're well prepared in advance of it. Again, so your development costs in this case would be construction costs, fit out costs, and any other costs like that. So, excuse me. It all depends really on what project you're developing, but factor in all the costs that are involved, even the ones you're not aware of. The best way of doing that is by talking to other groups who've been through the process and ask them, okay, you did this last year or 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Tell us all the bad things that happened to you. Tell us what went wrong from day one, what obstacles you came across that you weren't aware of. And, they've been through it, they've done the dance. You've got to basically just say, tell us what we need to be aware of here. And they will, because you're not competing with them. Look at do site visits, go meet other organizations, go visit other counties where they've done this and done it successfully. Ask them what they did, how they did it, how it was funded, and what are things to avoid, and to not, make sure you don't do the same things. What we do when we bring our services to the table is, we've been through this with a lot of organizations. We can make these things aware to people, say, look, we're being involved in an organization, this is the problems they had. Definitely don't do this, definitely do this. And that helps as well. But, absolutely don't try to start something yourselves without looking at how others did it first, because they've gone through the learning and the pain, and they'll help you avoid that pain if possible. So source of funding then. So your operational costs, your new project development costs, your analysis costs for potential projects, all this has to be paid for in some way, right? So the first thing we look at with every organization is, have you the capacity to generate any fees? So that could be for services, products, facilities, membership, whatever it might be. So people say, well, we can't charge for anything. There's always something you can charge for. There's always something you can do that you can generate money and revenue out of. And it might generate you a whole lot of money. Might generate you, enough to cover the costs of it. But what you're doing is you're showing the funders, we've got the capacity to actually, generate revenue ourselves here in some shape or form. We're not completely reliant on being subsidized by someone else. Because if you're completely reliant on government support or government grants, that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable at all. Because if that funds are cut, or if their grants are reduced, or whatever it might be, or they decide to switch the funding administration to another organization and they then change their criteria, whatever it might be, you might have a situation where you're now down in terms of funds, and you've no other way of getting that funding in. That's not a good thing. So you always show the funders, we've got our eggs in many baskets here. We can bring in money from different sources. We've got sponsors, we've got a fundraising program we do every year. We charge for fees for certain things, whatever it might be. All these things. The membership one is probably the most common one, where you charge a membership for membership of the organization. And that might have benefits to the members or mightn't have. Again, you might run events. Again, a lot of groups, what they do is maybe things like training or educational programs, or publications, or website with resources on it that they can charge for, whatever it might be. Just be creative. You're never going to generate enough income to keep cover all the operational costs. You just never will. And no not-for-profit organization will ever have enough income to cover all the operational costs, but certainly try to show some income coming in from some sort of fees. One-off grants are fantastic, but they're one-off. They won't do anything to the bottom line. Okay, they'll cover, a renovation, they'll cover signage, they'll cover a website, they'll cover, a publication, they'll cover an information campaign, they'll cover signage, whatever it might be, but they're one-off. Okay, ask that question, as I said earlier on, is there a cost in after this to keep these things maintained or keep them going? So if you get, say, a grant to build a website, fantastic, brilliant. But who's going to pay for the ongoing hosting each year? Who's going to pay for the management of it each year? Core grants are where you're getting core funding. So typically they would be like your health services, HSE, Section 39, Section 38 grants, where they're covering core costs like staffing costs. So things like 90% of disability services in Ireland are outsourced to companies, if not more than 90%. And they're primarily to companies like Enable Ireland, St. John of God's, Brothers of Charity, and smaller disability organisations. But they're all operating on service level agreements with HSE, where they're being paid to deliver those services on their behalf. And they cover things like administration costs, staffing costs, sometimes rental costs. You've got companies out there operating under as social enterprises under the Community Services Programme. So the Community Services Programme is funds from Pobble, which provide basically employment grants to employ a manager and staff. That programme is under review. The review was done, and the whole social economy in Ireland was reviewed. We're waiting to see how the results of that review will impact on that programme going forward. I think they'll probably scrap it. This is my own opinion on it. I have no insight into it besides my opinion. They'll probably scrap it because it's not really fit for purpose anymore. And they'll probably create a new social enterprise model. The previous one was the social economy programme, the false social economy programme. Then it became the community services programme. And I think there'll be a new programme probably announced this year. If there is, that's probably the one I would say you'd be focusing on, because it's the one fund that would provide employment supports. When it started back in 2000, and I was involved in it back in 1999 when it was piloted, at that time they granted for a manager and 10 employees. Then it went down to manager and 5 employees, and the last program was manager probably and 3 employees. It is an employment incentive program, so there has to be skills and training elements involved in it, but that would provide core grant aid for employing staff. Normally there's a percentage of that is allowable towards administration costs and for overheads, but it's primarily going towards employing staff. With that grant, under the last program, you had to be shown to be paying part of the salary, so they wouldn't give you 100% of the salary. They'd give you the minimum wage, and you had to then pay beyond that to your staff members. So you have to show you're paying them more than the minimum wage, and that had to be then covered by your own core fund, your own operational funding. So core grants are something that is what we need to be kind of concentrating on. If you're looking at operational costs to be covered by grant aid, that's what I mean by core grants, that you will get a grant each year to fund your operations. The other ones would be TUSLA in family resource centres. You got childcare subvention programs as well, where you got grants to provide staffing costs or to cover staffing costs. Like, for example, Leader won't cover ongoing operational costs. They might fund a coordinator for a project for a specific period of time, but it won't cover their cost long term. So again, we can look at that, see what kind of core grant aid might be out there that would be relevant to yourselves and your organizations. The other one is fundraising and online fundraising. Again, even if you are core funded, you need to have a fundraising strategy. And again, they will look for that because they're not going to, any organization, as I said, is not going to say, okay, we don't like you're 100% reliant on us or 100% reliant on grants. We need to see you've got capacity to generate money as well locally. Fundraising has got a dual approach to it. One is generating funds to keep the operations going, but secondly, it's also a marketing tool, because through your fundraising, you're actually promoting the service you provide. You're getting people involved, getting the community involved in that fundraising as well. So they're getting involved in supporting the local community project, supporting the environment, whatever it might be you're actually doing. Traditionally, all fundraising has been offline through your kind of standard fundraising events, kind of your face-to-face events, like your street collections, your church gate collections, your fashion shows, your race nights, all this kind of stuff, golf classics. COVID put a kind of big dent on that because we couldn't actually meet anyone or do anything with the public, so everything went online. In a way, it was a silver lining because it kind of caught groups on to the fact that they could actually fundraise online, and it also opened up the doors to, they now realize that they could actually fundraise outside their local community and target a lot more people than there's people in their local village or local town or local parish. They can now target people who left the parish many years ago who wanted to give something back. So we've seen a lot of organizations during COVID actually increase their fundraising considerably. Even though they couldn't run any events, their fundraising increased considerably because people knew they couldn't fundraise, so they actually offered to give them money through online donations because they knew they were going to be short. So they used it as, they said, okay, we can't fundraise. We need to look at the other options here. They actually didn't, in some cases, I know one group locally in Kerry that doubled their fundraising during COVID because they went online. They wouldn't have gone online only for COVID. They never had been online before, and they ramped it up, and there was money coming in constantly. So it wasn't based on one event, it was constantly coming in, constantly throughout the year. Sponsors and partners as well. Again, I would look at this as being a key thing for yourselves. There's companies out there that want to get involved. In your case, just be careful who you are partnering with. A lot of companies will look to get involved because they're, they want to say, we're supporting an environmental project here, turn a blind eye to what we're doing on the other side of things, and look how good we are in terms of getting involved in the local community and involved in local environmental projects. Again, you got to be very careful in terms of who you're partnering with. They have to be aligned to your objectives and aligned to your ethos and your goals as well. Just don't pick the partner that's saying, look, we'll get involved in this. You have to be, very, very careful in terms of who you're getting involved with. That's every organization. But there are companies out there who want to get involved. There's a lot of larger companies out there who've got specific people working within their companies that want to support, and their job is to actually partner with community and voluntary organizations and charities. So some of the bigger ones like Vodafone have, Lidl have, they're ones that I worked with in the past. They've got people that are just, their job is to be their corporate social responsibility directors or their sponsorship officers, whatever it might be called. They're looking to get involved in projects. Sometimes they won't get involved in a small local level project. And that's where the likes of the iCatch network has an opportunity to go and do kind of a deal at national level, because now they've got impact across the country. Whereas if you go, say, with a local project, you know, if you're a large corporate, you know, there's no real benefit for me from marketing or PR value here, because it's very, very localized project to a small local area. However, if I get involved in a national level project, there's a lot more exposure there, because I'm covering not just the Republic of Ireland, but also the North as well. You know, so here's a chance for me to get involved in a wider scale project through one organization. So in terms of, I know it's not through grants, but it's something I certainly would think you should be looking at as a network. How do we get the network sponsored by a company, and that money then is split amongst the network members? Is definitely an option. If you're talking about the larger organization, the larger corporates who have, you know, serious money to put into this, that's what I'd be looking at doing. Going as a network, there's a lot more exposure for them, a lot more PR value out of it, a lot more. And they will have their corporate social responsibility hat on, they will have their environmental hat on, but at the end of the day, they're companies, they're marketing lease. They, you know, a big part of this is the marketing value out of it in terms of what exposure they get and how good it looks for them, you know. So if it's a national, and cross-border initiative that they're supporting, that to me is something to really tap into, you know, and go big. Don't just, you know, say, can you, you know, if you're doing something that big, go big in terms of what you're looking for. And I think there'll be, you know, certainly a number of doors opening up there for you. And I can talk about that, you know, we can have a longer think about that over the next couple of weeks and come back with some suggestions to you, but it's something definitely that you could tap into. And if you were able to manage that, that's where the network then could look at larger scale grant aid as well, because now you got that kind of power behind you in terms of, we got this matching fund. We've got the corporate sector involved, private sector involved, the local communities are involved in it. Now it's time for the local authorities to get involved, or departments get involved in that as well. Donors and philanthropy, you know, similar to fundraising again in terms of tap into that. There's a lot of, you know, philanthropic funds out there, such as the Ireland funds. Again, and most of those funds have an environmental remit. So it's probably one of the areas that you would be eligible for. A lot of our organizations I work with, they're not eligible for those funds because they're very specifically focused on things like maybe, you know, disability or youth or environment or whatever it might be. They're not widespread in terms of they cover everything. They're very, very specific. In terms of loans, which you try to avoid if you possibly can, but with larger scale capital projects, you're going to have to have some sort of loan, because you need to matching funds, you need to bridging finance to get the project off the ground, start the project, then get reimbursed through the grant. We do work with Clan Credo primarily, and Community Finance Ireland as well. The reason why we do mostly work with Clan Credo is because it's a local person living locally from here that's actually responsible for this area. So that's why we just basically work with her, because we know her. But Community Finance Ireland as well provides social loans. You've also got the banks, they will get involved as well, commercial loans. Credit unions actually tap into those too. They are social enterprises themselves. They're owned by the community, they're owned by the members, and they're getting more and more involved in community projects at local level. So I will be going to, not saying you can't go to the commercial banks, obviously you can, but the credit unions would probably be more supportive than some of the commercial banks. The social banks, that's their remit, they will support these projects. And again, it's mostly for bridging loans, or in some cases for matching finance. And then I said before, in-kind contributions as well, labor, materials, equipment, professional fees, consultancy fees, they can all be provided through in-kind contributions. With the labor side of it, again, that can be, as said, can be kind of complex, because you've got to have someone, you know, supervising, you know, the certain skills might be involved, or trades might have, you know, certain insurance involved. So you can't get someone who's basically, you know, do the electrical works unless they're certified and you can sign off on it. But things like materials, you can, you know, materials probably the biggest one actually we would see, where materials are sponsored. So like a local building provider providing timber or blocks or cement or sand, or one company, our group we work with, they got some of the play equipment for their playground. The actually local company bought some of the equipment for them, and then some other local I think they were a carpentry company made some of the timber framed equipment for them and just donated the equipment to them. And all they got was like a plaque on the side, said kindly donated by XYZ Limited, you know. But they got pretty much all their equipment donated, which was huge. It gave them a fortune. Okay, so they're kind of source of funds. I'm not going to go into all those in detail because it's not the purpose of this program. So what I suppose in terms of the key thing, in terms of the one thing I want to talk to you about before the grants. So what I'm going to focus on in terms of source of funding over the next number of nights is grant support. But one thing I want to just talk to you about is, if you're not familiar with it, is the tax incentives. So the various different tax relief that's available for charities that have charitable status or that are approved bodies with revenue. So, and this goes back to our fundraising again. So if you're looking at, say, trying to get the local community involved in donating and fundraising and giving you money for your specific projects. And a lot of what you're doing obviously are rooted in the community. So you want the community to get involved in some way or another, whether it be through supporting you through volunteerism or supporting you through funding. If you get approved as an approved body with revenue for charitable donations, if a PAYE work gives you €250 in any 1 year, and that can be done by direct debit over 12 months, so about 20 odd euros a month. Once they're a PAYE worker, you get them to fill in a form, revenue form, and you can then submit that form to revenue, and you can claim back the tax they paid on that €250. So if they're on a higher rate tax of 40%, you can claim 40% back on that €250. So it means that you're not only getting €250 from that individual person, you're now getting another top up from revenue on what tax they paid. So what we do a lot of work with groups is that they might look at doing a kind of a direct debit scheme for 12 months. So they might get, 100 people giving them €250. And that's, let's say 20 odd euros per month, which is, let's say €2,000 a month that they're getting. They then go to revenue at the end of the year and they top that up with revenue, then reimburse them the tax that's been paid in that €20,000 and they get another top up on top of it. But now they can go to the bank and say to the bank, look, we've got €2,000 a month coming into our account here through direct debit scheme. We've now got repayment capacity to borrow money. Okay, so rather than trying to fundraise a lot of, at the outset, they'll borrow the money to get the project off the ground, and then they'll fundraise through direct debit scheme with local people to pay off that loan over 12 month or 24 month or 26 month period. So that's important, and that's only for PAYE workers. So if you come to me as a company, you don't get any relief on the money I give you because I'm not giving it to you as a PAYE worker. However, if you go into a company and you say to the company, if you give us €10,000 as a donation here, as a sponsorship, because sponsorship is a marketing expense to the company, they can claim that as being a marketing expense. So they're reducing their tax liability by €10,000. So all you do is give them a receipt for, Tom O'Leary and Associates paid, €10,000 sponsorship. I can give that to my accountant. He'll put that down as a marketing cost, which reduces my tax liability by €10,000 when I'm doing my tax return. So most companies will be aware of that, but it's a nice selling point to them as well that if they give you money as a sponsorship, they can claim that as a lawful marketing expense. But the key one would be your local people who want to get involved. And if you ask them for €250, it's a lot of money. But if you say, can you sub to direct debit for 12 months, €20 a month, that's manageable. But the key thing is you're getting a top up from revenue on that €250 at the end of the year. The reason why it's important from a grant perspective is a lot of people use this to match their funding from the grant with the grants. They use it to pay off the loan that's used to, so they get a loan as matching funds, and they use this donation scheme, donations and fundraising to pay off that loan. And the reason why they do the fundraising to pay off the loan, that otherwise their loan will be coming out of their operational costs and it adds to their operational costs. So we always look at is keep these projects separate, make sure they're sustainable on their own. Mihal, do you have a question?
Yes, Tom, thanks very much. It's two of the categories you mentioned there about funding sources. One of them is membership fees, and the other thing is what you were just talking about there a minute ago, let's say fundraising online. And you mentioned there about if you're not a charity. Some of the groups in this network in iCatch are registered charities, and some are not, but are on the way. So the question I have for you is it permissible for a group such as ours? We're a company limited by guarantee, but we're not yet a registered charity. Is it permissible for us, A, to charge membership fees, and B, to do fundraising online?
Yeah, I suppose in terms of you can charge membership fees anyway. You don't have to be a registered charity to charge membership fees.
Yeah.
That'd be from the it's just basically it'd have to be obviously something in return for the membership of the group.
Sure.
But they might say, well, I'm not going to join as a member because you're not a registered charity, and therefore we can't see where the money's going to or whatever it might be. The fact you're a company limited by guarantee is you're already audited anyway. You've got checks and balances in place. You're doing an annual return every year to revenue.
Yeah.
Your accounts are available for public viewing on CRO, etc., etc., etc. Can you do online fundraising if you're not a charity? You can. Again, some groups might think, or some individuals might think, well, they're not a registered charity. There's no oversight here. They're not, once you're not saying you're registered charities, you can say, we're a charitable organization if you're not a registered charity and regulated by a charity regulator. But you can do online fundraising.
Okay.
So a lot of clubs, a lot of sports clubs, for example, won't be registered charities, but would do fundraising. Yeah.
We had another session on governance before Christmas that Liz organised, and the answer from that lady was pretty much similar to yours on the membership side of it, but we just didn't get into the thing at the time, as far as I remember, about the online fundraising.
Yeah.
So
where I suppose it's becoming I suppose a lot of people are kind of very much kind of on the fence about the charities regulator, because the charity regulator is a very good thing, because it's regulating the sector and it's making sure people have confidence in the sector, which is really important, because there's been a lot of scandals over the years that money's been misappropriated or whatever it might be. So the regulator was all about instilling confidence in the general public that giving money to charities isn't a dangerous thing to do. However, a lot of organizations feel that the regulator is the audit and control requirements are too onerous, and they're actually stepping back from becoming registered charities because of it. And there's other issues as well in terms of the amount of money they can generate and things like that. And there's other reasons why they're not involved. Yeah. Why some groups feel that they should be registered charities, that it does, and they are regulated by the charities regulator, it does give the confidence of the general public that we can say we're regulated, everything's above board, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that'll give them more confidence as opposed to maybe giving money to a group that's not being regulated. The way around that really, Michal, is the fact that you would show very clearly and be very transparent on your website, for example, about what you do, your structure, showing the money that was brought in last year and the money that went out last year, that kind of stuff. That really adds more kind of credibility to the organization, more so than even being part of the charities or being regulated by the charities regulator. But certainly you can once you're not going out there saying we're a registered charity and you're not, it's key. Now with the tax relief, I need to just check that. Do you have to be regulated by the regulator before you can apply for the tax relief? Because this is a revenue scheme where you apply to revenue to become an eligible body. I need to just check, is that only available to charities that are now currently with the charities regulator? But I can check that out for you. I think in the past it wasn't. You could just apply as a one-off, but I'll just check that. Does that answer your question okay?
Yes, it does, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, great. Okay, so just for, I suppose, in terms of the grant aid and grant support, and I suppose this really key thing for the next couple of nights, I was going to give you a quick overview before we finish up tonight. With the grant support, as I said, there's two types of grants. There's your specific grant aid, which is for one-off projects, and there's annual grants that are kind of core grants that come up every year. Just in relation to year projects, do you want me to focus specifically on the grants that are coming up over the next, this month and in February and probably March, and work through those as examples, or do you want to just look at generically what's involved in applying for a grant? What would suit you best in terms of, do you want me to pick a number of those grants and say, okay, let's go through the process if you're applying for this grant or whatever grant it might be, what you go through? It's the same, look, it's pretty much the same thing anyway in terms of the work you do and preparatory work you do to apply for a grant is the same for any grant, but we can focus on one specific grant that you're all applying for if that would assist you or support you. What you thinking of that?
There's one grant coming up. I think it helps fund I think some of the core funding. Is it called the Community Activities Fund?
Okay.
So that's one I've not applied for before, and maybe looking at that and to see whether it is going to be worthwhile. But okay, the deadline is something like the 14th of February.
Okay.
Well, it depends on which county you're in, actually. I'm in Mayo, and I think for Mayo, it's the 14th of February.
Okay, it's called the
some
Community Activities Fund.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other comment I would make, Tom, is that several of the groups here are pretty familiar with LawPro, and in fairness to LawPro, they're very user-friendly.
Yeah, they are, yeah.
We've had seminars with them. So I don't think, now just speaking for ourselves, that we need to spend a lot of time figuring out how to build LawPro, just because they're very straightforward. But some of the other ones, including Leader, are not so straightforward. So certainly some worked examples in that or other ones would be better. Yeah.
Okay. I can concentrate on Leader if you want, though I would put a caveat in there that the Leader program is a currently in transition. So the new program, which will be hopefully in 2023, we're presuming that there won't be massive change in the way that they're structured and the way the criteria. There never really is a huge change in the actual criteria in terms of how the application process. There will be changes obviously in terms of the type of projects they support. But yeah, we can focus on the current Leader, presuming that it's not going to be changing much under the next program. And I think from your perspective, from an environmental perspective, the word on the street is that the next Leader program is going to be very much focused on environmental projects anyway. And all projects going forward, current projects going forward under large capital projects are very much focused on, there's a section in all those applications to show how your project helps meet climate action goals. So climate action is a massive part of these applications going forward for all capital projects. So if you're doing a large, say, RDF capital project or URDF capital project to Rural Regeneration Development Fund projects, which are $500,000+ projects, there's a large part of those applications are focused on how your project supports climate action objectives of the government. So it is moving very much towards that. But the next Leader program certainly will be focused on that. Yeah, so I can use Leader as an example. And if you can do Leader application, you can pretty much do any application because they are pretty complex, in fairness. And I don't have any go for large scale funding. I know. Linda and Chris and George, there you said you got a life program funding there recently. But any rest of you going for large capital grants over the next 12 months or hoping to go for them, or is it all kind of more smaller projects or just operational costs?
I think, Tom, that not a lot of us go for capital grants, really. I mean, I might be wrong there, but we're not really at that stage. I think maybe Lochcarra might be doing it, or maybe Blackwater. So Alan might be going for the larger ones. So, but most of us are kind of more around the 100 to 200 range, if we can at the moment.
Okay.
But there's the climate action fund as well coming up. So that one's going to be announced soon. So that might be another one that we could maybe look at. I suppose we don't really have the details on it yet. So, but you can look at that's going to be through councils as well. So
what I might do, Trish, is and Liz, I might over the next couple of days, I look at what's out there that I think might be relevant to you. Okay. And email you and say, okay, I've kind of identified the following. And if you come back to me and say, look, can you also throw this into the mix as well? We can then maybe identify, the grants that are coming up that are relevant to you, and then look at what's kind of common between those grants in terms of what you need to have, ready for them. Like, to be honest, the majority of grants, what we do is we put together what we call a grant file. And a grant file is all the relevant information that every organization will look for when you apply for a grant. So you've all the preparatory work done, all the information is there in place to be ready to be submitted when the application deadline comes up. So that'd be relevant to every grant. Some you don't need all of it, some you might need more than others. But that's the key. So what we can do is if I pick some of those grants and you come back to me and say, can you also add these in? We can look at the criteria for them and see, how you meet that criteria. And then I suppose from the perspective of actually writing the grant application, what are the key things for you to focus on? Okay. So, what I want to, I suppose, the key thing for us is that, it's about giving you the best possible chance of getting funding, and you're competing with enough of other organizations. So as some of the rights grant applications, what we do to kind of get our best case forward, and the kind of tricks of the trade in terms of the kind of key things we put into the application in terms of wording, what we concentrate on, and I can kind of go through that with you, and that'd be relevant to every application that you'd be going for. So I suppose the key thing just on that is that the steps that we would look at is researching what grants are available. So knowing the deadlines and criteria. Again, I suppose the key thing is in terms of what are the aims of the grant, where it's coming from, what's the strategic context behind it, which is really important. So like they don't decide to launch an opportunity for grants without it coming from somewhere. So normally it's linked to some strategic policy that's being prepared or produced or published by the department. We look what previous groups have been awarded. So that kind of shows you what the precedent has been set in the past. So what types of groups have they funded in the past. We also look at kind of geographical areas that have been funded as well. And, has been kind of has other areas across the country been kind of, got more support in the past. And we use that to our advantage as well. So there's areas around the country that kind of there's gaps there that hadn't been funded previously. We use that within the application as well. Again, consultation and needs analysis, has that been done? Again, what documentations are required from them and are they on file? We normally, and this is something that I said, this part I'm talking about we'll be doing over the next 2 nights, is the generic application, so that you pick one and you do that application, get feedback from me on it, and that kind of then acts as your generic application, as your template as such, that you can work from. So when we do lots of grant applications, we don't start from scratch every time we do grant application. We go to previous ones and we use that as a template, especially ones obviously got funded, and we use that as a basis then for the next one. Okay, so so if we're doing say an RDF application and we've done say 10 of them, we don't start from a blank canvas each one. We look at other projects similar to it and we use that as a template. So this worked, this doesn't work. We get the feedback and we use that. So if you've got a generic application done for a specific grant that's coming up now, you'll be using that then as your template going forward for every other grant. Okay, because if it was successful. If it wasn't successful, you change it obviously and improve it. But if it's a successful grant an application that you're successful on, that becomes your template. Okay, because I would say 60% of every grant application is generic information that you would have for previous applications. Okay, that you're not just kind of rewriting from the beginning every single time. Again, in terms of just completing the application, having all technical and support documentation required. A lot of grants get turned down not on this because the grant application is poor or because the project isn't worthy of it or whatever it might be. An awful lot of grants get turned down because they haven't submitted a document or there's a technical issue with the actual application. So, for example, it's not dated, it's not signed, the supporting documentation wasn't correct. The file format on a non-application that you submitted, the file you submitted with the application was in the wrong file format. They're very small, simple things that can stop an application being assessed. That means you got to wait for the next time around to get that project assessed. And that's all down to, again, just being badly organized and rushing. With the online applications, they are better because they're more streamlined. They don't look for as much information as the older applications that were handwritten or submitted in physical hard copy. But there's no room for error. You've got no wiggle room when it comes to applying. If you get it wrong and you do it wrong, you can't go back and change it. So that, and it is a huge issue with a lot of organizations where it's a technical side of things that they get caught out on. The grants planning, again, source of grants that we look at would be Funding Point, Through the Wheel, Active Link, CARO for yourselves, Climate Action Region offices, your local PPN and your local authorities, public participation networks, should have an updated website with all information on grants and opportunities that are coming up on a regular basis. Some local authorities are better than others. We get on the email lists of all the government departments. So we contact the press office, we contact their departments and get on their email lists, and they would then email you when you're on the list. So they email out the information when there's a grant coming in available. So, you can also go onto the department websites and look at the press releases, but it's just easier if you get on their mailing list. They'll issue you the press release and the announcement of a grant when it comes up. So there's lots of ways of getting information on grants. There's a lot of grants out there. There's a lot of sources, so it's about keeping on top of that. and have, as I said, one person kind of monitoring it. And then making a decision which ones you go after and which ones you don't go after. I would say like that for every 10 grants are announced, there might be maybe 2 or 3 that are relevant to you. The rest aren't. That can become a problem because then you might think, well, I'm not going to bother, keeping an eye on this, regularly because most stuff that comes up is not relevant to us. It's that one time we don't look at it is when you miss an opportunity. So keep an eye on it anyway. And as I said, like we would keep an eye on these things probably every week. Through the various different sources we have. It takes a couple of minutes, 9 times out of 10, it's not relevant to anyone I'm dealing with, so I don't pass any information on. But there's always one that might, you find one that there is something relevant to. So again, it's about keeping an eye on it and seeing what's relevant, what's not relevant to you. Yeah, have you got time to put it together? Is it worth your while? Is the funds available? Worth the effort involved? And then making a decision on it. So normally there's one person that's responsible for keeping an eye on it, bringing that to some committee to say, I've identified X, Y, and Z. Let's make a call on do we go after it or not go after it. Okay. The call normally is based on, is it worth it from a funding perspective? Is the monies involved too low or sometimes too high? What's the work involved? What's the criteria? Do we have the supporting documentation they require? Are we ready for it? Are normally the questions we would ask in terms of going after it. And again, in a lot of cases, you just don't bother going for them because they're not really relevant. So again, there's sites, Community Exchange website on Active Link. It's updated regularly. The Wheel funding point, it's about €130 membership for that each year. Again, it's updated regularly. They've got links to the various different criteria as well, so all the information is in one place, which is handy. I suppose in some sample grants, again, Leader, Community, obviously, Law Pro, Flag, Town Village Renewal Schemes, Outdoor Recreation Infrastructure Scheme. I suppose they're the 5 that are probably most relevant to yourselves in terms of the projects we've been involved with that have got funding. And again, you can see that they range from, they're all pretty decent in terms of scale of funding available. The larger ones, which are probably not relevant to you, would be the RDF, URDF funding there for $500,000+ projects. They're led by local development companies or local authorities or a publicly funded body. The other ones then would be your PUBL. Again, keep an eye on PUBL website because they manage a range of programs. And again, it's about being made aware of what's coming up in terms of the deadlines there. Your local authorities then would have your community enhancement program, your community support funds. And they got various different funds throughout the year, depending on the local authority as well. The best thing to do with local authorities, you already have obviously direct contact with them anyway, but is to find out who the key person is there that will pass on this information to you, so you get on their radar. So you're not constantly looking that there's stuff coming into your inbox constantly. What grants are available. I find a lot of the local authorities as well. In fairness, they're good at disseminating information down to communities as well on what's available and what's coming up. Again, some are better than others. CLOR funding, Community Foundation grants, Rethink Ireland grants, sports capital funding, which might seem as an obvious one, but again, it's any ward-based activities are eligible for funds under the sports capital program also. We've been involved in a few where there's been things like, say, water sport equipment, things like pontoons, disabled angling points have been funded through sports capital. Again, maximum grant there is €150,000. So there's lots of grants out there, only a sample of them. What I do as part of this, as well as I put a kind of a full database together for you. So you have a list of all the grants that are available that are relevant to you, and you might be aware of ones out there that I'm not aware of. We can add to it as well over the next 2 weeks, and then you can have the access to it. So it's about then just kind of basically keep an eye on what's happening with them over as you go on. I suppose a big thing what we do as well as the funding calendar is we start marking down on a calendar when these grants become available, so that you're aware of it. So it's very easy, especially with a lot of things happening, that you forget about a deadline. So what we tend to do is, when I say we, the groups I work with, we get them to, some cases that's simply just they have a wall chart on the wall in their office somewhere that they mark these things down. But we try to get them to use like a spreadsheet or Google Calendar or whatever kind of calendar they want to use. where they're marking in the deadlines. Okay, what we try to do there is on the deadline, say if the deadline, say for example, is February the 14th, like obviously this is January the 5th or whatever it is. So, you've got a month or so, we'll be marking in the date we're going to start working on the application, and then having in kind of milestones in there. So we're ready then for the application deadline. There might be an overlap there where there might be a couple of grants on the same deadline. Normally there is. That's not a bad thing, because when you're gathering information, you're gathering information for both anyway. So like we would, like if I'm doing grant applications, say for sports capital, I might be doing grant applications for 10 clubs, all the same deadline. I use this kind of a chart to manage the progress with all those applications. So I'm on top of each part for them, wanting to get from different groups or different people or different whatever. So it's important, it's a very, very simple way of just planning the work you need to do for the grants. This might seem like, is this kind of a lot of work and overly complicated for a grant application? It just means that there's no issues with it. It gets done. It's just like managing it as a project. But make sure you set deadlines for certain things, because things like February 14th deadline, which is a month away, that'll come up pretty quickly. And what will happen is that you find that maybe on the 12th of February, we need to submit our annual accounts, and we haven't got them, and our accountant has them, and we email our accountant, and our accountant does get it in time. And then there's panic stations to get that document in time. So it's by having kind of a plan in place in terms of your timing, in terms of what work needs to be done to get the grant application in, having that documented somewhere and you're managing it would stop all those kind of panic, kind of last minute kind of rushing around gathering documentation. It's not as difficult if you're only dealing with one application, obviously, compared to say if I'm dealing with say multiple applications, but it is something that I would suggest you do. So grants marked down when the deadlines are, then your fundraising again, if you're doing fundraising, marked down when you're going to do that, and your sponsorship, when's the best time to have your sponsorship. So you're planning all your fundraising activity, whether it be grants or otherwise, throughout the year, and you're putting in deadlines to get everything done. And this is where you can start delegating as well. So you can start delegating work to people on a committee to say, okay, can you look after getting the annual accounts? Can you look after getting the bank statements? Can you look after getting the loan approved? All these things. But there needs to be one person that's managing it, because otherwise this won't get done. If it's an online application, have one person responsible for the application. Don't delegate it to a team to write the application. Really important not to do that, because what happens is that you've got, say, 3 people doing different sections. It reads like there's 3 people doing different sections. It doesn't read well as an application. Certain things we done, one section might be done right, another section might be done that great. Some person, I'll do section 3 or whatever it is, and they don't do it in time, and then there's panic again. Have one person responsible for writing it. Yes, they can get input from loads of people if they want to, but one person is responsible for writing the application and submitting it. Okay, really important. The same with, say, the contact person on the application form and the contact email. This is a tiny thing, but it can be an absolute disaster. That person who's submitting the application and they're responsible for it, they're responsible for it. They're the contact person with the department. If they have an email they don't check only once a week or once every now and again, or it's the wrong email they give, or it's an email they don't ever check, then you've got a problem. We had a situation this year with a group who got funding approved. They went to get an extension on it because there were delays in what they were trying to do. And when they went back, they said they missed the deadline for extension approval, and they had to get back 25,000 euros in funding. All because the email address the person gave was an email address, a Gmail address that they never use. They never saw the email because they never checked it. The department's it's not their responsibility to kind of hound someone and keep emailing them the whole time. The email stated very clear, if you want to change the deadline on your application and extend it out by a certain 6 months, whatever it is, it has to be in by whatever date, June the 1st, let's say. She never saw the email. Went to get the extension in July and said, you missed the deadline for extension, give us the grant back. So it's this very small thing, but it cost them, that Gmail address cost them 25,000 euros. And that's unforgivable. So just make sure when you're putting people's contact details down that they're correct, and the contact person is the contact person, not someone you've just delegated who weren't aware of it. The administration, all that, again, I'm just going through this really quickly because we'll be covering it in detail the next couple of nights. Have a finance committee. If you don't have one, set one up, because there's a lot of work in getting funding in. You might have a treasurer, you might have an administrator. That's usually the person who's responsible for the grant applications. Yes, they will get support from other people, but they're ultimately responsible for it. I would always say, if you can get someone within the organization that's responsible for grants and grants only, if grants are a big part of what you do and you need to look for applying for a lot of them, it becomes a very full-time job, or definitely a full-time job for parts of the year anyway. Look at the things like spending approvals, signatories, online banking, all those are relevant because, again, they're tied into your grants as well. Okay, your finance committee, the administration, all these things become important when you're drawing down the grants. And having the proper procedures in place for grant drawdowns and proper financial procedures in place is really important. Your financial reporting structures in place, really important, because if you've got annual reports done, annual returns done and annual accounts from your accountant, that's going to be plus. So if you've got a company by guarantee and you've got annual accounts done, you've got an accountant that's basically auditing those for you, that's a plus, because that gives confidence to the funder that there's no oversight there by someone external to the organization. If you've just got a constituted group and you've got a treasurer, again, I would be saying on this finance committee is a local accountant who is basically making sure we're doing everything right here, giving the person who's giving you money confidence that you can spend it properly and report on it properly. Have a reserves policy set in place. Look at your company accountant, very important. If you don't have an accountant, you should have. If you've got a company, obviously you will have a company accountant. If you've got a constituted group, I would get an accountant on board as a committee member, just again add that layer of confidence on there for the funders. Bookkeeping software, again, this is more for grant kind of drawdown purposes and kind of managing your expenditure. If you use some sort of bookkeeping software, it's a lot easier to generate reports. So when you've got to submit those reports as part of a grant application, you can generate them pretty quickly yourselves. So they might look for, let's say, your annual accounts, but they might also look for projections going forward. Again, to prepare those, if you don't have any kind of up-to-date management accounts, or for example, if you're looking for up-to-date management accounts, which you should have, if you don't have those, you will have to prepare them in time for your grant application. If you're using some sort of software where you're doing your bookkeeping via software package, you can generate those reports in seconds. So you're not going back trying to do them very quickly before the deadline. So there's kind of some administration points. Documentation is required, which we'll be going through in more detail. Again, you mightn't have a strategic plan in place. You might have a business plan. You might have a feasibility study. If you do, that's going to provide all the documentation, all the information you need to submit in your application. So every application will look for needs analysis. Why is there need for the project? Why is there need for you to be in existence? Why should we fund the operational costs? What's the rationale behind it? What strategic objectives do you have in place as part of your overall plan? What is the strategic context? And this is the one that I'm going to spend a bit of time with you on next week. Is where does this fit nationally in terms of the context or local level? So how does your project tie in with the local county development plan within your local authority region? How does it tie in with our rural policy, the rural development policy or rural future? How does it tie in with the environmental policies? How does it tie in with climate action goals? How does it tie in with any strategy that's relevant to your project? How does your project tie in with it? How does it reflect the objectives of that strategy? So for example, there's a tourism project. How does it tie into the tourism strategy at local level and national level? And that's really important because this is where you focus their attention on. Because if they've said, we want to do X, Y, and Z at a national level, if you're doing that for them at local level, it's very difficult to say no to supporting that, okay? So we will always show how your project ties in with national policy and local policy, really important. The operational model, you have to show that you got capacity to deliver on the project. And that we'll go into the plan and we'll go into your application form. Sometimes within the application form, there's not much scope to elaborate on that. So it's something that, again, we look at it in terms of showing you how to show how you got the structures in place to manage and to implement the projects. The last one is financial viability and impact analysis. The financial viability will be based around, they want to see the cost structure for the project, the source of funding you have, and looking at, in some cases, they'll look for that, if it's a large scale project, they look at projections going forward as well. And then impact analysis. So we're talking about how you measure the socioeconomic impact, the environmental impact, at local level. So how it's going to impact the environmental elements of the project, how it impacts on your local community. Does it create jobs? Does it meet social objectives? Whatever it might be. Again, the value for money analysis also for the larger scale projects. Things like you would have in place would be annual report, which would show your track record in terms of what you've done to date, your capacity to manage public funds, your annual accounts. Again, some groups won't have their annual accounts for last year ready, which no group would have this year. You won't have the last accounts you'll have will be 2020. So they'll want to see 2021 management accounts. Are they in place? Do you have them available? Do you have to do them up? Does your account have to do them for you? Your constitutional memos and acts of association, if you're a company by guarantee, have you got those on file? Are they with your accountant, solicitor? They should be on file with yourselves. Your quotations, have we fulfilled the procurement requirements? Have we got the relevant number of quotations? Again, I'll talk about that in detail next week because it's something that's always catches groups out. And again, it's about looking at the criteria in terms of what they'll accept and what they won't accept. And if you're talking about leader funding, that's a huge issue. Planning details, if there's planning required on a project, technical documents, if it's a building project or capital project, is there drawings required, bill of quantities from a quantity surveyor, surveys, proof of consultation. This would tie back into your studies up here. If you're providing it, so normally we would say, yeah, the group carried out a feasibility analysis, they undertook consultation with the local community through surveys, stakeholder consultation. They might look for the proof of that, or they might just accept that you've done it. Tax clearance, sometimes they look for that up front. Most often that'll be at the time you're being awarded the grant, you're at kind of contractual stage. They look for tax clearance. Policies and procedures, again, they might specify what policy and procedures they require you to have in place and to produce those, or to have at least to have them on file for all the purposes down the line. I'll talk through about what normally they will look for or what you should have anyway. And then as well, in terms of insurance, they might look for that at the grant application stage. Normally it's a contractual phase is where they look for details of your insurance. So these are things like that are just basically technical, we call them technical documentation that you should have anyway, regardless of what you're applying for. But it's in a lot of cases, the areas that groups fall down because they just don't have them on file or have them available when they need them. So the ones I looked at there today was the law program, but if you, as you're pretty familiar with this, we mightn't concentrate on it. We can if you want to, but as I said, I'll pull out a number of grants that are coming up over the next while that I think will be relevant for you and email those on to you. And if you come back to me and say, Tom, can you also add in these onto this list as well? So what I'll do after today is I'll do that, email it out to you. What I'll also do is I'll send you on these slides to Liz. If I send you on these slides, Liz, and you've the recording from the show as well.
Yeah.
And what I'll do is between here and say next week, I'll make a list. We have most of them anyway, but I'll put a database together of all the grants that are available that I believe would be relevant to you. Okay. And with the various different sites and links, so you have that as a database to work from, if that would be a benefit to you. And as I said, if you come back to me by email over between here and next say Monday or Tuesday, and say, look, can we focus on the following grants? We can include those in the next two sessions if that suits. Okay, but the key thing really from tonight is it's not just about grants; it's about planning and knowing what you're actually looking for and what funds you require is the biggest part of any process really. It's about understanding what you need money for, when you need it, how much you need, and what are the options of getting that money in. And is there other ways besides grant aid we can look at before we look at grants? Because it's not just the only show in town in terms of funds. Does that make sense to you?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Any specific questions on what we covered, or is there anything you want me to look at or to discuss with you? We would be probably just kind of cover very briefly tonight for the last part of the session there. I'll be covering more detail in the next two sessions, but I want to try to make them as relevant as I possibly can to what you're looking for.
Tom, do you want to start at 7 o'clock next time? It's just in terms of time.
Yep.
If the people are okay with that, it's just it's 9:20 now, and what do most people feel?
Yeah, that would be good.
Okay, so 7 to 9.
Hi.
Perfect. So I just saw that there Michal just on the note there about the Law Pro session. Yeah, I actually Liz announced me there before Christmas, so I was going through that, which is actually very, very good slideshow. With all like it's got pretty much it's got more sources that I was aware of even, so it's actually very useful. So like there's that, anything that's not in there that I have addition to it, I can add to as well. But what I was going to do is take that and just make kind of a database using some of that information, and then others I would have as well on top of that. But it's a very, very good. That was a very good workshop.
Folks, thanks very much, Eva.
Thanks, Bob. Okay.
Good night.
Great.
Thanks very much,
Good night.
Liz. Look down.
Great.
That was great. Thanks a million.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Tom.
Thanks,
Good.
Tom.
Tom, thanks, Liz.
Okay. Thanks very much.
You're
Take
welcome.
care.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
I was actually should have stopped recording.